Fjord, northern Norway, the early hours of the 22nd of September, 1943. Inside a steel tube barely 50 feet long, 4 men breathe through a periscope no thicker than a broom handle, while 40,000 tons of German battleship rides at anchor 20 feet above their heads. One of them, Lieutenant Donald Cameron, has just watched his depth gauge fail. He cannot be certain how far beneath the surface he is, or how close he is to scraping the hull of the very ship he has come to destroy. Months earlier, senior officers in the Royal Navy had called craft like his a novelty. Pram dinghies, some sniggered, toy submarines built by men who didn't understand modern naval warfare. Cameron is about to prove them catastrophically wrong, and he is about to do it from underneath the most powerful battleship afloat. The ship above him is the Tirpitz, sister to the Bismarck, armed with 8 15-inch guns, so heavily armoured that conventional torpedoes struggled to trouble her. She had sat for 2 years in the fjords of occupied Norway, doing almost nothing except existing. And in existing, she had tied down more Allied resources than almost any other single vessel of the war. Winston Churchill called her the Beast. Every time she moved even a few miles, the Admiralty diverted battleships, aircraft carriers, and cruisers away from other fronts, simply to watch her. Arctic convoys carrying tanks and aircraft to the Soviet Union sailed in permanent dread of her breaking out. Bomber Command had tried to sink her from the air and failed. Midget submarines, 4-man vessels barely large enough to stand up in, were what remained when every conventional option had been exhausted. The men who crewed them were volunteers, mostly in their early 20s, drawn from submarine service and trained in the black, freezing waters of a Scottish loch few people had heard of. They were, by any measure, the underdogs of the underdogs. And their target was tucked behind nets, minefields, patrol boats, and the sheer natural fortress of a Norwegian fjord ringed by mountains. To understand how 6 tiny submarines came to be Britain's best answer to the Tirpitz, it helps to understand how badly every other answer had failed. Bomber raids in 1942 and early 1943 had achieved nothing beyond near misses and lost aircraft. A submarine attack was, on paper, impossible. A conventional boat could not get close enough through the shallow, heavily patrolled approaches to Fjord without being detected long before it came within torpedo range. The Royal Navy's response, developed under conditions of considerable secrecy from 1942 onwards, was the X-Craft, a 51-foot Midget submarine capable of carrying 2 enormous saddle charges of Amatol explosive, each packed with roughly 2 tons of high explosive, designed to be released beneath an enemy ship's keel and detonated later on a timer. The theory was elegant. The execution required men to sail, submerge in cramped, damp, freezing steel tubes for days at a time, navigate through minefields and anti-submarine nets by dead reckoning and periscope alone, and then manually maneuver beneath a heavily defended battleship without being seen, heard, or caught in the ship's own protective netting. Training took place at Loch Carnborn on the west coast of Scotland through the summer of 1943, and it was grueling in ways that had little precedent. Crews practiced again and again against a moored battleship, HMS Malaya, standing in for Tirpitz, working out how to defeat anti-torpedo netting by cutting or lifting it, how to navigate a fjord using little more than a compass and a stopwatch, and how to survive inside a hull with barely enough headroom to kneel. Some of the young officers selected for command were extraordinarily junior. Cameron and his fellow commanding officers were lieutenants, several barely out of their 20s, entrusted with what amounted to one of the most audacious special operations of the naval war. 6 X-craft were selected for the mission: X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, and X10. Their targets were the 3 major German battleships, known to be sheltering in Norwegian fjords: Tirpitz, the battle cruiser Scharnhorst, and the pocket battleship Lützow. Operation Source, as it was designated, called for each X-craft to be towed across the North Sea by a full-size submarine, released close to the Norwegian coast, and then to complete the final, most dangerous leg of the journey, under its own power and its crew's own nerve. The passage began in the second week of September 1943, towed on long cables behind 6 conventional submarines, among them Thrasher, Truculent, Certis, Scepter, Stubborn, and Sea Nymph. The X-craft made the crossing largely submerged, their passage crews swapping out partway through for the fighting crews who would take the boats into the fjords themselves. It was, from the outset, an operation that punished machinery and men in equal measure. Within days, things began to go wrong. X9 was lost when her tow parted in heavy seas. She and her entire passage crew went down with no trace, one of the earliest and starkest reminders of how unforgiving this kind of warfare could be. X8 suffered catastrophic problems with her limpet charges, which began leaking and threatening to explode inside the craft itself. Her crew were forced to jettison both charges early, and, crippled, the boat was eventually scuttled by her own crew, who were picked up by a nearby escort. X10, tasked with Scharnhorst, suffered a cascade of mechanical failures: a jammed hydroplane, compass failure, and a serious leak that left her unable to complete her attack. Remarkably, her crew nursed the stricken craft most of the way back to open water, where she was found and taken in tow, only to be scuttled days later when she could not be saved. Of 6 boats that had set out, only 3 remained capable of reaching their targets: X5, X6, and X7. All 3 were bound for the same ship. All 3 were going after Tirpitz. By the night of the 20th of September, X5, X6, and X7 had slipped their tows and were making their way, under their own battery power, into the outer approaches of Altenfjord. What lay ahead of them was a defensive system, built by an enemy who knew exactly how valuable the ship inside was. Anti-submarine indicator nets stretched across the fjord's entrances. A minefield lay in the approach channel. Patrol boats crisscrossed the water, and around Tirpitz herself, moored close to the shore of Fjord, hung a further barrier of anti-torpedo netting, designed specifically to stop exactly this kind of attack. Getting an X-craft through all of it undetected was going to require equal parts precision navigation and pure nerve. Cameron's X6 struck trouble almost immediately. Battling to make her final approach, the boat's periscope had already been damaged, badly reducing Cameron's ability to see where he was going, and on the approach into Fjord, she ran aground, not once but twice on the fjord's shallows, before finally breaking through the outer defensive net, apparently through a gap left open for the passage of a surface vessel. Then, in the pre-dawn darkness, came the moment that could have ended everything. X6 briefly surfaced, close enough to a German patrol boat that her crew could hear voices carrying across the water. For a long breathless stretch, discovery seemed inevitable. it did not come. Whether through luck, poor visibility, or simple disbelief that anything so small could be there at all, the enemy failed to identify what had just broken the surface a few hundred yards from their most valuable ship. Cameron pressed on, submerged once more, feeling his way toward the shape of the battleship, now looming ahead of him on what was left of his instruments. Basil Place's X7, meanwhile, was fighting a battle of its own. Attempting to work through the anti-torpedo net surrounding Tirpitz herself, the little submarine became entangled, her bow catching fast in the mesh. For a period that must have felt far longer than it was, Place and his crew worked the boat free by trial, feel, and sheer bloody-minded patience, easing her backward and forward until the net at last released its grip. It was the kind of setback that could have ended the mission then and there, trapped and helpless directly beneath the guns of the ship they had come to kill. It did not. West 7 broke free and continued in. What followed, in the last hour before dawn, on the 22nd of September, was the payoff for a year of training and a fortnight of accumulating disaster. Cameron's X6, her periscope all but useless, her hull damaged from the earlier groundings, closed beneath Tirpitz's hull and released her 2 charges directly under the ship, set on delayed fuses. With the boat now taking on water and barely controllable, Cameron surfaced X6 close alongside the battleship and was seen. German sailors on deck stared down for a moment at an impossible sight, a British Midget submarine bobbing on the surface directly beside their ship, deep inside one of the most heavily defended anchorages in occupied Norway. Cameron gave the order to scuttle and abandon ship. He and his crew went into the icy water and were hauled aboard Tirpitz herself as prisoners, taken below decks on the very vessel they had just mined. Place's X7, unaware that X6's charges were already ticking beneath the hull, pressed forward and dropped her own charges under Tirpitz in turn. Doubling the weight of high explosive, now resting on the Fjord's floor beneath the ship. Attempting to withdraw, X7 became entangled in netting for a second time, was detected and came under fire and depth charge attack from the alerted German crews. Place brought her to the surface directly alongside a shore boom, ordered his own men out, and watched the boat sink beneath him. 2 of his crew escaped and were taken prisoner. 2 others, trapped below when the boat went down, did not survive. There remained a third X-craft, X5, commanded by Lieutenant Henty Creer, and to this day her final movements are not fully known. She was sighted briefly, apparently under fire from the ship's own guns, depressed as low as they would go, and was never seen again. Whether her charges were laid or not, whether she was destroyed by gunfire or lost to some other cause, remains one of the genuine, unresolved mysteries of the operation. Her entire crew, Henty Creer, Whittam, Nelson and Whitley, were lost. What happened next took place not in the water, but underneath it, on a delay fuse ticking down in the dark. At around 8 o'clock that morning, with Cameron and his men already prisoners aboard the very ship they had attacked, the charges detonated. Witnesses aboard Tirpitz described the ship being thrown bodily upward in the water, as if struck from below by something far larger than anything visible on the surface. The scale of the damage was immediate and severe. Main engines were wrenched from their mountings. One of her main gun turrets was jammed. Steering gear, generators, and fire control equipment were smashed or knocked out of alignment. Flooding spread through several compartments. Tirpitz did not sink. Her hull remained intact, and she stayed afloat. But as a fighting ship, she had, in the space of a few seconds, been reduced from the most feared vessel in northern waters to a wreck moored in her own fjord, incapable of moving under her own power for months to come. The convoy threat that had tied down so much of the Royal Navy's strength for 2 years had, in a single stroke, been effectively neutralized. Not by a battle fleet, not by a squadron of bombers, but by 6 young men in submarines the length of a cricket pitch. Cameron and Place spent the rest of the war as prisoners, first questioned intensively by their German captors, who struggled to comprehend how craft so small could have penetrated defences built specifically to stop them. Both men survived captivity. In recognition of the raid, both were awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for gallantry. Extraordinary decorations for lieutenants in their 20s who had spent the defining action of their careers folded into a steel tube barely wide enough to turn around in. Other members of the surviving crews received the Distinguished Service Order and Distinguished Service Cross. It remains one of the most heavily decorated small actions of the naval war, a recognition of just how far outside ordinary risk these men had operated. Tirpitz herself never fully recovered her fighting effectiveness. Repairs dragged on for months, and by the time she was seaworthy again in the spring of 1944, she remained a target rather than a threat, subjected to repeated attacks by Fleet Air Arm carrier aircraft and later by RAF Bomber Command flying from bases in the Soviet Union and northern Scotland. In November 1944, Lancaster bombers carrying enormous tallboy bombs finally capsized her at her mooring near Tromsø, ending, once and for all, the story of the ship Churchill had called the Beast. But it was Operation Source, more than a year earlier, that had broken her back as a strategic weapon. The moment she stopped being a fleet in being and became, instead, a stationary hazard, slowly being repaired for a war she would barely fight again. The men who had been mocked for crewing toy submarines had, in the space of a few desperate hours inside a Norwegian fjord, achieved something no battleship, no bomber squadron, and no full-size submarine had managed in 2 years of trying. The X-Craft program did not end with Fjord. Variants of the design would go on to lay markers ahead of the Normandy landings and, in 1945, attack a Japanese heavy cruiser in the Far East. But it was under Tirpitz's hull, in the freezing dark of that September morning, that the idea was truly proven. 6 small boats had set out. Half were lost before they ever reached their target. And still, against every reasonable expectation, stacked against them, 2 of them got through, laid their charges and changed the naval war in the North Atlantic, in the time it took a fuse to burn down.